friends, welcome back to my channel. Today we're going to do a video that I have been putting off for a few weeks now. We are going to talk about my 2023 reading year in review and also my top 10 reads of 2023. So part of the reason this was really hard to do is I just always struggle to pick a top 10. It's always incredibly challenging for me to narrow it down that much because I just have a hard time making choices and picking favorites. But I think I finally have it down to a stack that I am happy about, that I don't think there's anything that I would sub in for anything else. So we're just gonna do it before I can talk myself out of it again. All right, let's dive into the stats. First, I read 231 books in 2023. In my reading goals for 2023, I had said I wanted to read fewer books for this last year, and I did that. I did read about 25 fewer books than I had in 2022. So better. I think I would still like for it to be around 200. There were a couple months last year where I read a few more books than I was really comfortable with. The pace just didn't feel comfortable for how I was reading, but obviously I'm very much a mood reader, so I think I might just have to let go of that arbitrary number, but I do like continuing to be conscious of slowing my reading down just a little bit. I did DNF 33 books this year. You can see which ones it is if you're curious. For the most part, I DNF'd only really if something wasn't holding my interest. I only read maybe one or two books this year that I found maybe not offensive, but like reading it made me angry. And I actually think the one that made me the angriest I finished. I didn't DNF it, so that's not even a good measure. But you can see a lot of it was romance, and I DNF'd a lot of sci-fi as well, which is weird because I usually love sci-fi, but I was not working for me in the same way it has worked in the past. I DNF'd books by authors that I loved this last year, which is also unusual. I had also said that I wanted one of my goals to be that I DNF'd more frequently and faster, and I maybe didn't totally succeed in that. I still finished books that in hindsight I wish I had DNF'd, but I think I did make a marked improvement from 2022, and I think I'm gonna do better in 2024, if only because I would hesitate to DNF if the book was in a vlog, and I think I just this year want to get comfortable with, even if I'm featuring a book in a vlog, I just need to DNF it and then talk about the DNF in the vlog. But then it's also hard because most of the time when I DNF, like I said, it's not because the book did anything offensive, it's just because I lost interest or it wasn't like what I was looking for at the time. Let's just go through the months super fast. In January, I read 13 books and I had an average rating of 4.13, which is pretty good. I did a lot of rereading that month. I caught up on quite a few series, and that's also my month that I take off of Instagram, and it tends to be like my favorite reading month. And you know, in terms of ratings, as we go through the months, you'll see that this January was my highest rated month overall. And then in February, I read 17 books. Oh no, wait, this was my highest rated month. The average rating for this month was a 4.22. I did quite a few rereads, and I read, gosh, it's interesting that that rating is so high because looking at these books, like there are books that I really loved on this list, but then there are also books that I did not love and that I gave fairly low ratings, but I think the rereads really saved it because I think every book that I reread in February, I gave 5 stars. And then in March, I read 21 books and I had an average rating of 3.8 stars. And March is always a really fun month for me because that's middle grade March, and I love having an excuse to just dive into middle grade without feeling like I need to also balance it out with more adult titles. I can just like really soak up that age category. And then in April, things calmed down a little bit. I read 18 books and my average was a 4.03. And this was a fun month because this was a month where the romance I picked up really worked for me. Most of it was fantasy romance. So I'm very particular about the kind of fantasy romance that works for me, but when I find one that works, I really, really love it. And then in May, I read 21 books and my average rating was 3.99 stars. And this was maybe not reflected in the ratings, but this month was maybe my favorite reading experience month because I was reading all the YA and middle grade books that were on the Nebula shortlist, and I found some of my favorite books of the year. Doing that project, I loved it so much, and I'm really excited to do it again this year because my experience last year was so fun. Then in June, I read 22 books and my average star rating was 4.05 stars. And this was a really fun month again because I was still doing that Nebula project. And then I also reread Mask of Mirrors that month, which was one of my favorite series. And I read book 2. I read a lot of really chunky books that month, but I had so much fun with my reading generally. And I also finished my very slow reread of Pride and Prejudice, which I had been reading along with a podcast, and it took a year to get through it, but I really loved that, like getting to settle in and be like really nerdy and academic with the text. And then in July, I read 20 books and my average rating in July was a 3.84 stars. The highlight of this month was definitely participating in Summerween for the first time. That was so much fun. I loved it so much. I am a new horror reader, and so I'm really delighting in finding what kind of horror works for me and what kind of horror I'm not as drawn to. Then this was also kind of a disappointing reading month because I was reading the Hugo nominees for this month and a lot of them were very fine, which isn't what I want when I'm reading the Hugo nominees, but that's what we got this past year. In August, I read 18 books and my average was a 4.04 star. This month also had a lot of duds. In retrospect, I did continue on or finish some series that I really loved. I did find one of my favorite books this month, but I also had a lot of books that I was not as impressed with. That was also like the month that I read the newest Veronica Speedwell, and I was really disappointed in that story, in that mystery, and how that mystery was resolved. It's hard to be disappointed in a series that I've been reading for so long, but I just remember being really bummed about that. And in September, I read 23 books for an average of 4.09 stars, and 23 is really pushing like my comfort zone, but I leaned into audiobooks so incredibly hard that month, and I read a lot of children's books as well, but I found some series that I really loved, but then I also, read some books that I was pretty like meh about. So I think those meh books are always what throw me for a loop. In October, I read 24 books, which is really like where I have read too many. 24 always feels like too much. The average for October was 4.05, and I had a weird reading month in October because I started out the month only wanting to read Christmas or winter romances, and I didn't really get into reading spookier books until I think right before Halloween, even though I had been so excited about spooky reading season. When that season arrived, I didn't want to participate apparently. And then in November, I read a nice breezy 14 books and my average rating was a 4.12. That's a high rating, but when I look at these books, I don't feel super excited about most of them. So I might have to reevaluate how I rate books going into this year, because I feel like that average rating should be lower just looking at the title that I read in November. And then finally for December, I read 20 books and my average rating was a 4.19 stars. And this month was such a fun reading month. I found a lot of favorites and I really just absolutely adored the majority of what I read. I had a couple flops, but in general, it was a really solid reading month and I was really happy with the books that I consumed. So those are the stats for 2023. Let's get into my favorites. I did put these in order, but aside from the last two or the top two, these could really get mixed up and it wouldn't be a big deal. Like, I could make arguments to myself to slot them into different spots. And my number one and my number two really are kind of tied, but I didn't want to cheat too much, so I did give them numbers. But I mean, they were both my favorite book because they're both very different from each other, so they could tie and it would be fine. Let's start off with number 10, which is A Tempest at Sea by Sherry Thomas. This is the most recent, at this time, book in the Lady Sherlock series, which is a historical mystery series that is gender-swapped Sherlock Holmes. And so we have Lady Charlotte, who is our Sherlock, and she lives with her friend Mrs. Watson, whose husband was an army surgeon who passed away previously before the books even start. And I really love this one because, so Sherry Thomas does not hold your hand in these books, and she does not recap you when a new book starts. You just pick up where the last one left off, which makes it a really fun series to binge read. But now as we're into book 7, that obviously is like more of a time commitment than it was when there were only, you know, 2 or 3 books. In the past book before this one, all of our like cast of characters, our core group of people, were kind of scattered off doing their own missions. And then in this book, they are on a ship sailing to somewhere else, and suddenly everybody is brought back together in one spot. So it's a little bit of a locked room mystery because they're all on this ship. And then it's also not a reunion book, but it's always fun when like the gang is all brought back together again, some of them on purpose and some of them by coincidence. And I really loved where the slow burn romance went in this book. I just love the romance in this series so much. I think it's so impressive that 7 books in, Sherry Thomas still manages to have tension between those two characters, and there's still growth in every book, and there's always like a new layer of intimacy to peel back between them. I will be honest, I don't really read these for the mystery anymore. I am so invested in the characters that I don't pay much attention to the mystery or how it's resolved, which might make me a bad mystery reader, but I just love these characters so much that the mystery has become secondary for me. But this was absolutely delightful, and I love this series so much. Like, if I could only take one historical mystery series onto a desert island, it would be this series, hands down, as long as I could take the audiobook with me. And then number 9 is Saint Death's Daughter by C.S.E. Cooney. I don't know how to, this book is so weird and so unique. I can truly say part of the reason this book made it on my list is I have not read another book like this. It's just so weird. The setup for this book is, what if you had a necromancer who was literally allergic to violence? So anytime she's around a dead body that has died in a violent manner, like, her body has an allergic reaction to being in proximity to that, and even to just kind of hearing about violence. And so it's a really unique setup. This plot changes constantly. Every time I thought I had figured out what the plot was, it would take a left turn, and then there was something new introduced. But it felt very purposeful, and I really appreciated how well C.S.E. Cooney was able to keep me on my toes as she weaved this like not insignificantly length book. Like, this is a chunker, but I was totally invested the whole time. There's a found family aspect to this book that I really delighted in, and I just thought it was such a good time. It was also very quietly queer in a way that I really loved, and I am really hoping that this is going to be a series and that C.S.E. Cooney will write more books, because I really love their writing, and I'm excited to read more, and I'm excited to reread this book because I just thought it was such a treat. And number 8 is my only nonfiction book that made it onto the list, and it feels a little weird to have one nonfiction book on this list, but I don't feel like it would have represented my 2023 reading if I had left it off, but it was Stolen Focus by Johann Hari. Why You Can't Pay Attention and How to Think Deeply Again. This is about how the internet is breaking our attention span. And it's not a self-help book because Johann Hari is just as susceptible to this as the rest of us are, but I really appreciated the mix of memoir and not scientific, but like social science study, I guess. And I really loved how personable his writing was, and this is a subject that I am deeply, deeply interested in, and I was absolutely obsessed with this book. It was a big part of my personality all summer because I just couldn't get over how well it resonated with me. All right, number 7 is a little bit of a cheat. It's what is available in a series so far. It's the Thescape Gracers and the Scratch Daughters by H.A. Clark. And this is a YA contemporary witch series with a lot of horror elements. And I was like, the modern witchy CW show is my favorite to consume. It's so angsty and action-packed and dramatic, and I just think it's absolutely a blast. This series is not quite complete yet. Book 3 comes out shortly, the first part of 2024. So I'm so pumped for that because I just absolutely loved the series, and it was such a surprise because it was not on my radar at all until I picked it up for that Nebula project, and I was obsessed with it the whole time. It was so fun, so propulsive, super queer, like not quietly queer, like punch you in the face queer, and I really loved it. All right, number 6 is the only one I don't have a copy of, but it is Ise Explains It All. This is a middle grade novel told in verse and in diary entries, and Ise is in middle school, and she lives with her mother and her abuela, who they have just brought into their house. Her abuela has dementia, and so you're watching Ise struggle with her grandmother who's not always there, and her mom is a single mom and she works a lot, and then it's also about grief. It's a really heavy book. It's a really sad book, but the writing is gorgeous, and it was impossible to put down. I read it so fast, I think in 2 sittings, because I absolutely loved the voice, and I find novel in verse to be a really compelling story structure for me, and I think if you're a middle grade reader and you have not read this, I highly recommend that you pick it up because it was just absolutely fantastic, and I have yet to see a single negative review of this book because it's just so universally fantastic. All right, number 5 goes to the book that got me into horror this year, and that is My Heart is a Chainsaw by Stephen Graham Jones. I was not a horror reader before I picked this up. More importantly, I was not aware that I like slashers before I picked this up, but I picked this up on a whim. I was having some FOMO, and I was a little worried that it would be too scary, but I absolutely fell in love with Jade. I love the slasher 101 papers that are mixed in here in between the chapters, and I like really love Stephen Graham Jones's writing. It just clicked in my brain in a way that I found really satisfying, and I loved kind of the slow burn of the horror in this book and of the violence of this book, and you really are working your way up to this big explosive climax, and I blew through this so fast. I think I read this book in 2 days, and it is not a small book, but once I picked it up, it was impossible to put down. Audiobook is also fantastic. Kara G does the narration, and she's absolutely stellar at her job. She's fantastic. So if you haven't read this and you have a chance to pick up the audiobook, I highly recommend it. If you're on the fence because you're not so sure how you do with slashers, I would say read the first chapter. And the first chapter will let you know if this is a book you can hang with or if this is not going to be for you. I absolutely loved it. I think even if you're not a horror reader, like give it a try. You might be surprised at how well this works for you. All right, number 4 is Letters to Half Moon Street by Sarah Wallace. This is a late in the year favorite for me. This is a historical fantasy romance set in England, and it's epistolary, and we're following a man named Gavin who has moved to London to be the steward for his family's townhouse, and he's there by himself, and he's cranky and he's pretty antisocial, and he meets a man named Charles at the club that he belongs to one night, and Charles befriends him, much to Gavin's reluctance, because Gavin's just such a curmudgeon and doesn't understand why anybody would want to spend time with him. And it's letters between Gavin and his sister Jerry, and then Gavin and Charles, and it's just this lovely story of watching these two people fall in love with each other, and it's so sweet and it's cozy, and I really loved it. It's another book that's really quietly queer. Like Sarah Wallace has created this historical England that is very queer norm, and I just like all the swoony feels. All the swoony feels. And my number 3 book of the year is The Jasmine Throne by Tasha Suri. This is also a late entry. I read this in December as well. And this was the last book that I needed to read to complete the Sapphic trifecta from 2022 or 2021. This is set in a South Asian inspired world, and we're following Malini, who is a princess who's been outcast by her brother and isolated in this tower, and Priya, who is the handmaiden assigned to care for Malini, and it's about revolution and colonization and oppression, and I loved Tasha Suri's writing so much. This is the first Tasha Suri book that I have read. It's not going to be the last, because I found her writing so engaging. Sometimes with fantasy, it can I'll have a hard time tracking what's going on. Even if the writing is really great, just for whatever reason, sometimes it doesn't always stick in my brain, and I end up doing a lot of rereading to make sure that I'm really understanding what my eyeballs are taking in, and I didn't have to do that with this book. It just clicked right away. I didn't have to really reread, and the chapters are short, and so I just feel like I flew through this chunker. And I love the world building, and I loved the 2 main characters. I think like with all 3 of the books that are in the Sapphic trifecta, they're Sapphic, but it's because the characters are Sapphic, not because there's a Sapphic relationship, which I think is an important distinction. Like a book can be Sapphic without it being romantic. So I really love that representation, but that the romance has to take a backseat because everything else is just more important. And I like that. I know that can be disappointing for a lot of readers, but I dig that. Like, yes, loving somebody is important, but sometimes there's things that are more important, you know? All right, and finally we have my last 2, which technically are tied, but for the sake of having a numbered list, we're going to say that this is number 2, and my second favorite book of the year was The Vanished Birds by Simon Jimenez. This is a sci-fi unlike any sci-fi I have read before. This book starts out in vignettes, and you have about 3 vignettes of these people who you're not even sure how they're connected or what's going on. And it's not until I think the 3rd or the 4th chapter where you finally understand how all these things are connected. But we're following a pilot who makes a living by transporting goods to other planets, and because of the nature of space travel, she and her crew are not aging at the same speed that everybody else is aging, because it takes so long to get back and forth from these planets. But because of the nature of like the space travel, it goes a lot faster for her and her crew than it does for the people on the planet. I hope I'm explaining that in a way that makes sense. While she and her crew are on one of these planets, another shuttle-like craft crashes, and there is a little boy in that craft who is choosing to not talk or is not able to talk. They're not really sure, but either way, he's not able to communicate what happened to him, and so she and her crew undertake the care of this little boy. And it was, like I said, vastly different from anything I've read before, but the writing is gorgeous. Like, absolutely loved it. You grow to care for these characters so much, and this world is so interesting, and these little planets that they would land on, even though you're only on them for a short time, it felt like Jimenez had a vast history for each of these planets, and like he could have written a whole book about each of these individual side planets that they went on. So the world was just felt fleshed out so well. The ending of this book absolutely gutted me. I sobbed like a baby, and it's just absolutely phenomenal. I still think about it all the time, and it was just such a fantastic reading experience, and I think will be a forever favorite. And then my number one book of 2023, probably to no one's surprise, is The Adventures of Amina El Sarafi by Shannon Chakraborty. I am a Shannon Chakraborty fangirl from day one. I read City of Brass like right after it came out, and I've been absolutely obsessed with her writing ever since. And that continues with Amina. I am sure you all know what this book is about because I feel like it's been on a lot of favorites lists. I've even seen it on a least favorite list, but this is a pirate story, and we're following Amina, who has a retired pirate and then gets pulled back in for one last adventure, and it was great. It's technically set in the same world as the David Bad trilogy, but like 400 years beforehand, 600 years beforehand, like you're not going to see any of the same people, though some of the mythological creatures will feel similar. And I'm so excited for this series. I'm so excited for book 2. I think from what Shannon has shared on her social media, book 2 is going to be like a haunted house story, which I'm so excited for. So excited. So I just think this is such a fun adventure. Again, the audiobook is really delightful because you have dual narrators and there's a lot of theatrical elements to the audiobook without feeling over the top, and it's just such a fun time. There is a little bit of body horror, so you just take that into consideration, but it's just feels like such a fun, rompy adventure that's not too serious. It's just like a good time. Like if Pirates of the Caribbean, the movie experience, was going to be like turned into a book and made better, I think this is it. I vastly prefer Amina to Jack Sparrow. So yeah, that is my favorite book of 2023. So that is the end of this video and my little review of 2023 and my favorite books of the year. If you have made it to the end of this video, thank you so much for watching. And thank you for spending your time with me. If you want to leave a comment, I would love to know what your favorite book of the year was. If we had any similar favorite books. If you disliked any of these books. So like, don't hurt my feelings. Don't come for them too hard, okay? And if you want to leave a comment but you don't have anything to say, let's do the little octopus emoji, and I will talk to you all in the next one. Bye!